All right, folks, the topic we're considering now is public opinion. And in the first half of this discussion, I made the pessimistic case, the argument that we, the people, the American public, we do not know enough about government politics. We don't follow what's going on. We don't have an ideology. We don't really understand the language of the conversation of politics that is happening at the elite level. And so if we can't live up to our end in terms of the expectations of democratic theory on what the public should do, then maybe it's actually better, these elitist theories of democracy, maybe it's preferable that we have enlightened elites who are, if anything is to make democracy work, it's them. And they're the chefs, and we, the people, should just stay out of the kitchen and let them do their work. And there is no question, based on over half a century of public opinion survey data, that Americans lack any kind of sophisticated, in-depth understanding of politics. It's just, there's no challenging that argument. But there are a couple of ways to perhaps salvage the reputation of the American voter. There is an optimistic case regarding public opinion, and there are actually two parts of it. So I'm going to make that now, and then I'm going to, as I mentioned before, raise an issue that is, over the last 10 years, has become increasingly concerning, that gives me pause about the optimistic case. Okay, so part one of the optimistic case is at the individual level. And the argument here is that people actually do reason about politics. We do understand something about politics. We use low information rationality. We acquire some information easily, and we resort to all kinds of reasoning shortcuts. And by using these things, we can actually come up with something of an understanding, a grasp of what's happening politically in this country. Why do we use low information rationality? Why not high information rationality? Wouldn't a lot of information be better than a little? Well, yes, it would. But remember, there's rational ignorance. It's really not worth it to us to pay the high cost of becoming informed. But some information can be acquired for free. We're not going to do the amount of homework that's required to become fully informed, truly aware citizens in this country. Very few of us will do that. The payoff just isn't there. But some information is essentially free. You come across it as kind of a byproduct of just leading your daily life. Think about the economy, for example, or foreign affairs. In terms of the economy, if you own a home and are paying a mortgage, or if you're renting, if you have a bank account, if you have a retirement account, if you own stock, you certainly know whether you're working or not working, whether you're underemployed. If you buy things, if you buy gas or food, if you pay insurance, if you pay taxes, you have some sense of what's going on in the economy, about how those things are going, whether things are more expensive, whether you're able to make ends meet or less so. And that's not through any homework you've done, that's just through going about living your life. We may fail civics tests. Survey after survey, from actual academic surveys to person on the street interviews by Jimmy Kimmel and before him Jay Leno, show conclusively that people can't tell you which party controls Congress, or name the name of the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, or tell you who is the president of Russia. But people do have a general idea about the economy, about war, about social issues they care about, and they have just a general sense of whether they're pleased or not pleased with where things stand on those issues. Going back to a slide early on in the pessimistic case, I showed you the percentage of the public that falls into categories of ideologue and near ideologue, group benefits, and nature of the times. And that last one that I just mentioned, nature of the times, academics disparage that level of understanding in terms of people. If that's the whole of your grasp of politics, you're well below the rich understanding that elites would have, who can array their political views in the context of a left to right, liberal to conservative ideology. Sure, that's true, but maybe having at least a general sense of the nature of the times and whether you're happy or unhappy with the direction the country is going, maybe that's enough. I mean, do you really need any more sophistication than that to vote reasonably intelligent in an election? I mean, some would argue that, maybe not. We also use information shortcuts. There are ways to acquire, to arrive at conclusions that are pretty accurate. probably the same ones you would arrive at if you were willing to invest the time and effort and energy to do the extensive research and homework and really delve into politics. These information shortcuts include things like party identification. Party identification is a psychological attachment to a political party, and we'll talk more about it in just a second. There are also other ways, and psychologists refer to these things as heuristics, shortcuts, information processing heuristics that allow us to reach fairly accurate conclusions with pretty little effort based on information that's readily available. Let's talk about each of those in turn. So party identification is essentially a shortcut for what the candidates stand for. It's basically identifying with one or the other teams. We are a two-party system in the United States, as we've discussed at length in here, and most people have an affiliation, have an identification with one of the other teams, and that's called party identification. It typically originates early in life. It's often sort of inherited or acquired from your parents, particularly if you grew up in a household where both parents have the same partisan leanings. It was most likely passed on to you, often in the same way that a religious affiliation would be passed on. And it reflects a basic orientation towards politics. It doesn't necessarily reflect a whole lot of in-depth, nuanced understanding of the intricacies of political issues. It's more a my team, that team, us versus them. And it acts as an information economizing device. If you go to vote, most of the races on the ballot, the candidates will be running under one party label or the other. You often don't need a whole lot more information than that. You know what your team is. You can see the teams on the ballot. You vote with your team. That's often all most people need. Of course, not all races on the ballot are partisan. There are non-partisan offices, and so this doesn't work for that. But even in those cases, if you look at your mail at all in the weeks leading up to an election, the political parties will send out flyers, mailers, and you'll get a bunch of stuff online as well, of course, that indicate the party preferences on those allegedly, supposedly non-partisan races. Typically, those running for those do have a party affiliation. It's just not a partisan office. So even with those, you can look to your team, your party, for cues on how you ought to vote on those things. We also use other information processing heuristics. And again, the idea behind this is that we're unlikely to put in the effort to do the extensive data gathering to really accurately assess political candidates and political issues. It's just not worth it. Again, rational ignorance. You know, the payoff for you becoming super informed in a society where a better democracy only happens if millions of people become super informed, you alone doing it won't bring it about. So therefore, the payoff is just not worth it. The temptation to free ride is too great. But that doesn't mean that there isn't data that we get very easily, and then we often are able to go beyond the data. We draw inferences about politics, about candidates in particular, based on what little evidence is readily available to us. I want to give you a couple of examples from some elections in the past. This is candidate at the time and president at the time, George Herbert Walker Bush, at a supermarket in the context of the 1992 presidential election. Bush was running against Bill Clinton in 1992. Bush was the incumbent president, and we were in the midst of a pretty sharp economic recession. And one of the knocks against Bush was that he came from old money. He was from Kennebunkport, Maine, and he was perceived to be as sort of out of touch with the concerns of average voters. Again, his family, he had family wealth going back generations. He was old money, and he seemed to have a hard time convincing average voters that he understood their pain in an economic recession. So to combat this perception, Bush attended a convention of supermarket dealers, whatever that would be called. And as part of that, he went to a supermarket and got a tour of the market. As part of that tour, they went through the checkout line, and Bush was amazed at this technology that existed where you could scan an item and it would read the price. He had never seen that before. That technology had been around for decades at that time. But apparently, Bush hadn't seen that. He hadn't seen anything like that. His latest recollection of supermarket checkouts was where you had to key in the price of items. There was no scanning device. What this said to many people was that Bush doesn't shop for his own food. He clearly hasn't done that for decades. This created the exact opposite impression of what they were trying to create. This furthered the impression that he was out of touch with the electorate, and Bill Clinton was more in touch and would be a better steward of the economy in terms of the interests of average, ordinary people. Is that an accurate perception? Is that a fair perception? Not necessarily. Is that understanding based on a deep dive into Bush's economic philosophy versus Clinton's? Of course not. It's based on an impression from a photo op moment that went bad at a supermarket in the course of the campaign. But is it wrong? Here's another example. 4 years earlier, Bush was campaigning for president against this guy, the Democratic nominee, Michael Dukakis. Dukakis and his campaign was worried about Dukakis's standing with the public in terms of defense. Bush, this guy, George Herbert Walker Bush, had been a military hero. I believe it was in World War II. He was shot down in a fighter plane and managed to survive and parachute out. And he's a decorated war veteran. Dukakis had basically no military service. I believe he served in kind of a National Guard type role, but he had no active military service whatsoever. And the Democratic Party then, maybe less so now, but then certainly was regarded in general as more dovish, more passive on defense, as opposed to the more hawkish, aggressive Republican Party. And so there were some concerns about the extent to which people could see Michael Dukakis functioning as a strong commander-in-chief. So what his campaign decided to do was to put him in a tank and show how tough he was. Well, the photo, and you can see it here, the photo that came out of that made him look kind of ridiculous. The comparisons that the press immediately jumped to were Rocky the Flying Squirrel. He doesn't particularly look presidential to most people. He certainly didn't look like a strong commander-in-chief. He looked kind of funny. And, again, and most people decided in the course of the 1988 election that in terms of being a strong commander-in-chief, Bush was the better candidate than Dukakis. Again, is this based on any kind of in-depth understanding of Dukakis' defense and foreign policy views as opposed to Bush? Nope. Is it the kind of information that you would ideally want people to base their opinions on? Nope. But is it a completely invalid impression? I'm not sure that necessarily is. It turns out that in 1992, surveys showed that most citizens viewed Clinton as being better on the economy than Bush would have been, and Clinton won the election. In 1988, most citizens viewed Bush as a stronger commander-in-chief than Dukakis would have been. Bush won the election. Both assessments were based on very little hard evidence, very little hard data. But I'm not sure you could argue that they were necessarily wrong. So these are examples of ways that citizens can come across data basically for free through their daily life experiences as a byproduct of their partisan affiliation by just going beyond the data and looking at events that they happen to see and drawing conclusions that aren't necessarily, again, based on a lot of evidence, but they're not based on no evidence, and arrive at positions that are probably the same positions they would arrive at if they did all the homework. But they're not going to do all the homework because it's not worth it, so maybe this is the best we can do. But I think we often find that the positions that people arrive at, which candidate to vote for, Clinton or Bush or Dukakis, etc., it's probably the same position they would have landed on had they done the homework, and that's the key point. So maybe these methods are good enough. There's a part 2 to the optimistic case of public opinion. And everything I just said about information processing heuristics and party affiliation, going beyond the data, that all takes place at the individual level. I'm talking about individual citizens kind of navigating their world, navigating their way through the political world and trying to arrive at some understanding. But public opinion, though, is not about individual opinions. Public means all of us, the mass of us, the aggregate. The focus of all the pessimistic critiques that I started this lecture on were about individuals being uninformed and lacking in ideology and having inconsistent and unstable political views. But public opinion, again, means collective opinion, aggregate group opinion. And they're not the same thing. Now, you might argue, but aren't they the same thing? If you take a bunch of stupid people individually and you aggregate their individual stupid opinions, aren't you just going to get a big mess of aggregate collective stupid opinion? Not necessarily. Here's how. How much does this ox weigh? I'm going to stipulate it's an ox. I wouldn't know, actually. I Googled ox and this is what came up. So we'll just go with it. It's an ox. What does it weigh? Any idea? What would you guess? In 1906, Francis Galton, who was an English statistician, did an interesting little exercise at a county fair. They had an ox and they had a game going about, guess the ox's weight. 787 people entered a guess as to the ox's weight. The average, or the mean of their guesses, was 1,197 pounds. The actual weight of the ox was 1,198 pounds. How is that possible? That's called the miracle of aggregation. What certainly happened in this county fair example was some people looked at this ox and said, well, that's a 200-pounder for sure. And some people looked at that and said, oh, that's 20,000 pounds. People guessed. I'm sure there were wildly inaccurate guesses on the low and the high end, but those cancel out. And the more informed, reasonable, stable guesses around what was pretty close with the ox's weight, those were the center of gravity in this distribution of guesses. And this is called the miracle of aggregation. And in terms of public opinion, what it means is, sure, there are going to be extreme opinions on the left and the right on a whole bunch of issues. But you can kind of consider those as to be errors of opinion, those extremes, in the same way that a person guessing 200 pounds or 20,000 pounds about an ox that's 1,100 pounds, they're going to be in the extremes in those same way, and they'll cancel each other out. And the stable and the reasonable opinion is what's going to bubble up as sort of the center of gravity. And if that's happening in American public opinion, then maybe if policy is tied to that center of gravity, that centrist opinion, then maybe public opinion is stable enough and informed enough and reasonable enough that we're okay if public policy is connected to it. And you know what? It turns out that on most political issues that the country confronts, that is the case. What is the role of government in regulating the economy? Some people think that government should have total control in regulating the economy. We call those people communists. Some people think that there should be no role for government in regulating the economy. The market should run without any government interference whatsoever. We call those people radical free market libertarians. Most people see some sort of centrist middle ground where you need to have some amount of government regulation to prevent monopolies and deal with negative externalities and those kinds of things, but not too much that you slow economic growth. That would be right about here. We've already talked about abortion in a previous slide. I think it was in the context of public opinion. Some people think that abortion should never be allowed, and no matter the circumstances. Other people think that abortion should be allowed under any circumstances whatsoever. Most people are somewhere in the middle on that question. In terms of what to do about border policy in the United States, some people favor completely open borders. Anybody come in anytime you want. Other people would prefer to build a massive wall on the border and let no one in. Most people want some sort of reasonable compromise between permitting some people in but not anyone who wants to. In terms of gun control, some people want to ban firearms altogether in this country. Some want to have no restrictions whatsoever. Again, most people are somewhere in the middle. Okay, so cool. If collective opinion is relatively reasonable, relatively stable, yes, there are extremes, but those offset each other in the center of gravity that kind of bubbles up, and that dictates policy. That's where most people are. So if those people are voting with those issues in mind, then and policy is connected to that, then we'll have reasonable, centrist, stable policy on these things. Great, we're good, right? Well, no. Unfortunately. And I mentioned this previously when we talked about abortion. Our political divide today is actually not issue-based. If you recall the public opinion data on abortion that I showed you some while ago, Gallup survey data going back over 20 years showed that opinion on abortion has not really shifted in this country. Despite how controversial the issue is in American politics, what the public thinks about it has not shifted much at all. And yet we've become a much more polarized, divided country over that period of time. How can that be? How can we be so much more polarized, and yet on one of the most polarizing issues of the day, we haven't actually, our opinions haven't changed? It's because our divide today is not issue-based. It's not about the border or guns or abortion or the role of government in regulating the economy. Our identity today is tribal. Our divide today is tribal. It's identity-based. It's our team versus their team. And when you have that kind of tribal politics, that forms the fertile ground for a kind of political belief in which you've come to see your side as the side of truth and virtue, and the other side is evil. And not just evil, but actually colluding in secret to bring about harm to your tribe, to come up with some sort of malevolent plan to destroy your tribe. And that kind of political belief used to be on the fringes of American politics. It's much less so. And this is a development that's happened over the last 10 to 15 years, I would say. And prior to that, 10 to 15 years ago, I would have ended the conversation on public opinion with the optimistic case, the individual version, part one, the miracle aggregation, part two, and said, we're good, public opinion's cool, we're done. But the emergence of this kind of thinking in American politics and the preeminence the effect it's having in American politics today gives me pause and makes me wonder about the stability and quality of public opinion. And this type of political belief that I'm talking about, that is growing and infecting our politics in ways that are not good, is, of course, conspiracy theories. I really like this cartoon that you see on the screen here. If you go through it, it gets at the differences between, first off, just raw data that is basically meaningless. It's there, but you can't make any sense of it. And then you start to see attributes that certain pieces of data have that differentiate them from others. Then you start to see that perhaps these pieces are linked in some way. Then maybe you see a more nuanced understanding of how those linkages could be, and then maybe you can actually fill in the dots and connect one thing to another. That's all well and good. That's awesome. But we humans have a tendency to go beyond that. We have a tendency to see things in the data that just aren't there. This is not a unicorn, but if you're a conspiracy theorist, that's what you'll see. Now, I said if you're a conspiracy theorist, I should have said if you're a human being, that's what you'll see. I was on a plane recently on vacation, shortly before I recorded this video, and I'm looking at the window and I see these massive clouds, and one cloud, for all the world, looked like a rabbit standing up on its hind legs. Was it a rabbit standing up on its hind legs? Of course not. It was a random collection of molecules, but my eye saw that formation that resulted from a random collection of molecules and said, oh, that's a rabbit. We are hardwired to do this. And I want to give you another example of how and why. This is a trail that I run on quite often. It's the trail that parallels Del Dios Highway between Rancho Santa Fe and Escondido. And I was on this trail just the other day, and I saw this. What's that thing right there on the trail? If your mind immediately said, ooh, that's a snake, that's what my mind said. I saw that, and that's the first thought I had. It's not. It's a stick. I run trails 5 or 6 days a week. Every single time I run a trail, I have this experience. I see something up on the trail ahead, and I think, ooh, that's a snake. I did some sort of back of the envelope rough calculations recently to kind of figure out how often I was correct about that. Sometimes there are snakes on the trail. Sometimes there are rattlesnakes. You see them. They're memorable. Based on my best estimates, I'm correct that it's a rattlesnake maybe 1% of the time, which means I'm wrong 99% of the time. And yet every single time I see this on a trail, the first thing I think of is, ooh, that's a rattlesnake. Why? Am I just dumb? I mean, why doesn't my brain learn and update the information? How can I be wrong 99% of the time and not have my brain correct my perception so that when I see that up ahead, I say, oh, that's a stick? Well, you would think that if I'm rational and intelligent, that my brain would do that. You would think that I would want to perceive the world accurately. That's not how our brains actually work. You might think you're rational and logical. You're not. Our brains are hardwired in ways that actually make us more error prone in some situations, because making mistakes is actually better for our survival. I'm much better off mistaking a stick for a snake than I am mistaking a snake for a stick. If I mistake this stick for a snake, I'm going to be careful going up to it. And when I get up to it, I'll say, oh, that was just a stick. So I'm such a dummy. But I'm still alive. That snake didn't bite me because it wasn't a snake. If I mistake a snake for a stick, if I see that in the distance and say, oh, that's just a stick, and I ignore it, when I get up to it, it turns out to have been a snake, and it bites me, and I'm out there on the trail a couple hours away from anybody, I'm in some trouble. Our brains are hardwired to make mistakes in the direction that preserves us, that keeps our genes in the gene pool. My genes, my genetic ancestors were predisposed to make the mistake I make, to see that and think and assume it's a snake and find out I'm wrong. The ones who went the other way, who mistakenly thought that snake was a stick, their genes are no longer in the gene pool because they made that mistake. We are not hardwired for accuracy. We're hardwired for survival. And part of that hardwiring is teaching us, as our brains we have an inherent predisposition to connect dots in things in ways that keep us alive. But that's different than connecting dots in things that is accurate. The problem is when we apply this connect the dot phenomenon to the social world, sometimes our mistakes are the kinds of things that lead us towards conspiracy theories. Conspiracy theories are basically at their heart about connecting dots that aren't really there in ways that simplify the world for us and make us think we understand them and provide a simple explanation for what is really a very complex reality. But we don't like dealing with complexity, we like simplicity. So if you can explain all of it in one simple theory, great, except it's usually wrong. Conspiracy theories have been a part of American politics for a very long time. You can go back to the conspiracy theories about the Kennedy assassination, about the moon landing, about the 9/11 attacks, about mass shootings being faked, about the anti-vax movement, the birtherism, conspiracy theories pertaining to Barack Obama's legitimacy as president. There has always been that stuff. It had, for the longest time, been on the fringes of American politics, and it was just kind of amusing but not particularly serious. But now it's become increasingly mainstream. And I want to show you a video that gets into the psychology behind conspiracy theories. Let's see if I can make this work.
Been a part of our culture. The first mention of them was in the 1927 short story, The Tissue Culture King. In the story, people wore hats of tin and metal to block mind reading.
When I hear conspiracy theory myself, even if I know it's a conspiracy theory, I can feel the draw of it. There's a sort of magnetism that these theories have that appeal to us.
Nowadays, tinfoil hats are associated with conspiracy theorists.
There's a whole spectrum of belief in conspiracy theories, everything from people who dabble, which could be anyone, all the way to people who are absolute, die-hard, part of the group, acting on the conspiracy theory.
Is it possible that some people are more vulnerable to conspiracy theories? Or are we all at risk?
My name is Jonas Kaplan. I'm an associate professor of research at the Brain and Creativity Institute at USC, and I'm the co-director of the Dornsife Neuroimaging Center. I'm a cognitive neuroscientist, so I study how the brain works and really interested in the relationship between the mind and the brain and how the biology of the brain, how neuroscience can explain our minds, our psychology.
What makes conspiracy theories so appealing to people?
Well, they're not appealing to all people equally.
There are certain motives and socio-demographic variables that we know that tend to facilitate belief in conspiracy theories.
One of them is that people who are very high on the narcissism scale are actually much more likely to believe in conspiracy theories. So they have a grandiose view of themselves.
There's also consistent findings and evidence that people's sense of feeling powerless is associated with greater conspiracy theory beliefs, as well as kind of a feeling of uncertainty. I think that really played out during the COVID-19 pandemic, where there was so much uncertainty and we were really all looking for explanations of what is happening. And one very simplistic explanation was, well, it was a hoax, or it was a 5G conspiracy, whatnot.
During the COVID-19 pandemic, it was rumored that 5G actually transmitted the virus or made it easier to contract, and that vaccines, well, they were actually microchips. These theories spread via websites and alternative news sources.
That's one of the other things we see with conspiracy theories, is that they're very difficult to challenge. Any new piece of information that comes along, whether it appears to support the conspiracy or to deny the conspiracy, is often taken as evidence of the conspiracy by the conspiracy theorist. So it's kind of a clever mechanism the brain has of maintaining its current model of the world.
When the world is confusing or feels broken, we search for answers and sometimes find them in unlikely places.
So if a conspiracy theory can come in and tell you who killed the president, John F. Kennedy, for example, and you can't get a credible answer to that through a mainstream source, then you're going to be more inclined to believe the conspiracy theory because you're looking for answers. Mainstream sources are struggling to give you answers.
But when we try to resolve our questions, we may find more than one answer.
People are very often able to hold in their head two conspiracy theories that are directly in conflict. So, for example, people will simultaneously believe that Princess Diana's death was staged and that she's still alive, and also that she was murdered. And on the face of it, this doesn't make much sense, but what is the underlying principle here is that they believe that something is just not right about the official story, and it almost doesn't matter exactly what the alternative is, but just that there has to be an alternative that's being suppressed.
So conspiracy theories are not necessarily irrational or wrong. And I think what we are talking about in society at the moment, what is frightening us, are better explained or better labeled as conspiracy narratives. That is, ideas that are irrational to believe, or at least very unlikely to be true, that are not necessarily theories such that they are not falsifiable.
Conspiracy theories often appeal to people who are alone and anxious. Not only do the theories answer their questions, but they can also fulfill another need.
So if we're part of a conspiracy theory community, there's a sense of belonging that comes with that. There's a sense of shared belief. It feels good to be with other people who believe the same thing that you believe.
A lot of the reason why people become entrenched and why it's so hard to get them back out of conspiracy theories is because they join a group. And when they join a group, they become identified with that group, and everything that goes against that identity is put aside. The other thing that happens when people join a group is that they stop some of their critical capacities. So they don't inspect information on their own. They assume that the group has already done that for them, when in many cases it's just ideology and no one has looked into the facts.
One of the advantages to having a belief system that's resistant to evidence is that the belief system is going to be very stable across time. If you have to constantly update your beliefs with new evidence, there's a lot of uncertainty. You don't know what this model of the world is going to look like tomorrow. And that could be an uncomfortable feeling that many people are not willing to tolerate. So the brain really wants to protect itself. When we think about all of the biases in our reasoning, we have to think about what are the motivations that underlie them. The fact that our reasoning is motivated is almost always what makes it biased. The brain has a big challenge, which is to make sense of the world. And in order to do that, it has to pull together all of the information that it gets, the sensory information, things that we read, things that we encounter on the internet, and it can be difficult to make sense of. And that's an uncomfortable feeling when you just don't know what makes sense. And conspiracy theories are ways of making sense of an uncertain world.
With so much uncertainty, it's no wonder that some people are donning tinfoil hats.
The cognitive scientist there at the end said something I thought was really interesting. The fact that our reasoning is motivated has a lot to do with the biases in our thinking, and can predispose us to be more susceptible to conspiracy theories. By motivated thinking, motivated reasoning, he's referring to the fact that we don't approach raw data in a neutral fashion. We have pre-existing beliefs about how the world works, and we tend to filter evidence through those beliefs, and we tend to allow in the data that supports those beliefs and screen out the rest. And so that tendency, combined with our tendency to see patterns where none exist and connect dots that shouldn't be connected, you put all that together and you've got a pretty ripe environment for conspiracy theories. Let's talk about some of the conspiracy theories that have been on the rise and become more prevalent in American politics in recent years. This is some survey data that was done in the aftermath of the 2016 election between Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton. This reflects the percentage of people who believe in some of the following conspiracies. Do you think that President Obama was born in Kenya? Over half of Trump voters believe that the birther conspiracy theory, that Obama wasn't actually born in Hawaii, he was really born in Kenya, and therefore was not the legitimate president of the United States. That's a pretty racist charge to level at the first African-American president in this country, but there you go. Maybe most shocking is the 11% of Clinton voters that believe that is true. Millions of illegal votes were cast in the election. 62% of Trump voters believe that's the case. Again, maybe equally shocking is a quarter of Clinton voters subscribe to that view. This was the explanation that was offered for why Donald Trump lost the popular vote in 2016. He lost the popular vote by 3 million votes. He won the presidency because of the Electoral College. And Trump explained his loss, Trump being very one who doesn't like to lose, to put it mildly, at the feet of millions, allegedly millions of illegal votes cast in the election, a conspiracy to try to steal the election from him. And almost 2/3 of his supporters believed him. The following is getting to the conspiracy the theory that concerns me the most in American politics today. Leaked email from some of Hillary Clinton's campaign staffers contained code words for pedophilia, human trafficking, and satanic ritual abuse, what some people refer to as Pizzagate. That Pizzagate reference is in reference to a supposed the campaign headquarters for all of this stuff, pedophilia, human trafficking, and satanic ritual abuse, taking place at a Washington, D.C. Pizzeria. And in fact, nearly half of Trump voters believe that to be the case. One of them was so certain it was the case that he went to that pizza parlor armed with a gun to try and get to the bottom of it. And this supposedly was happening in the basement of this pizza parlor. It turned out that not only, of course, was it not happening, the place didn't even have a basement. Nonetheless, nearly half of Trump voters believe that. Shockingly, 17% of Clinton voters subscribe to that. And how they're Clinton voters, if they believe that about the Clinton campaign, is a puzzle I'll leave for you to tease out. This last set of conspiracy views is getting at something that is bigger than just that. Consider the following statement. Satan-worshipping pedophiles running a global sex trafficking operation control the U.S. government, media, and financial institutions. A storm is coming to sweep away the elites and restore the rightful leader of the country. And things are so off track, true American patriots may have to resort to violence in order to save the country. That set of beliefs is what is known as QAnon. Those three precepts put together are basically the whole of QAnon philosophy. That the government, the media, and financial institutions are controlled by these Satan-worshipping pedophiles who are running a global child sex trafficking operation. That's one. That a storm is coming to sweep them away and restore the rightful leaders. And of course, the most rightful leader to be restored, according to Q, is Donald Trump. And violence is justified in order to make this happen. And this is some fairly recent survey data that shows the percentage of the American public that accepts those precepts, those tenets, which are, again, the core of the QAnon conspiracy theory. Now, you might look at this and say, well, okay, sure, it's alarming that about 20% of the public actually believes that stuff. 16% agree or mostly agree with the first, 22% agree or mostly agree with the second, a little under 20% mostly agree with the third. But Professor Nichols, look over here. It's 80% who don't agree with that stuff. So we're okay, right? Well, the problem is, if you break down belief by party affiliation, you will, of course, not surprisingly find that QAnon supporters overwhelmingly sort themselves into the Republican Party. And this has had quite an effect on the party. Our political divide is so 50-50 today that if you have a camp of hardcore conspiracy theory believers who are set up in your party, that party cannot afford to completely ignore them and to ridicule them and to eschew them. You can't afford to aggravate and ostracize them out of your fold. You have to have them, you need them as part of your constituency to win elections, because if you lop off a large, or not even a 20% or 30% segment of your own party, you're certainly going to lose to the other party when it comes election time. So because of this, the Republican Party has been pulled somewhat in a more extreme direction because of the prevalence of QAnon belief within the party. I'm not saying that all Republicans believe in QAnon. That's not the case. Most Republicans don't. But there are enough Republicans who do that QAnon belief has had an effect on the party overall. Let's talk about some of the stuff that came up in the video about conspiracy theory believers. Research has shown that people who are more prone to believe and to fall for these conspiracy theories if they suffer from a sense of powerlessness, from a sense of uncertainty. If they are looking for simple explanations of how the complex world actually works. And if they can find a sense of community with others who believe that same way, that furthers the acceptance of conspiracy theory. In America today, of course, those views are found mainly on the political right, correct? The host of conspiracy theories that surrounded the pandemic, the origins of COVID in the first place, and the vaccine and all that went along with that. The conspiracy theories around the 2020 election, that it was rigged, that Dominion voting machines and the deep state and others stole the election of Donald Trump. All the conspiracy theories that are at the heart of climate denial. Those are all on the right, right? So it's really people on the right that we have to worry about in terms of falling for conspiracy theories. Which makes sense then in light of what Donald Trump said in People magazine in 1998. If I were to run, I'd run as a Republican. They're the dumbest group of voters in the country. They believe anything on Fox News. I could lie and they'd still eat it up. I bet my numbers would be terrific. Well, that makes all the sense in the world, right? And many of my Democratic friends are well aware of this Trump statement. I've heard it bring it up in a number of cases to suggest that Trump is really just cynically running as a Republican because he knows he can pull one over on that voter base. Well, here's the thing. Trump never said that. The fact-checking entity Snopes went through everything that they could find on People magazine 1988 or anything else, and there's no record of Trump ever actually saying any of that. Democrats are just as capable and liable to fall for conspiracy theories if the theory is telling them what they want to believe. Democratic reasoning is just as motivated and just as prone to connecting these kinds of dots as Republican reasoning is. What we know about conspiracy theories is that they can be found across the political spectrum. Some of the conspiracy theories of the past began on the left. Now, the anti-vax movement was initially a leftist conspiracy theorist. There have been conspiracy theories about the origins of the 9/11 attacks, saying that the George W. Bush administration basically orchestrated the 9/11 attacks. They were an inside job, and they were perpetuated in order to benefit the defense industry. The only challenger to President Biden right now, as I record this in July of 2023, for the Democratic nomination for the presidency in the 2024 election is Robert F. Kennedy Jr., a prominent Democrat who is also an avowed, staunch anti-vax conspiracy theorist. Conspiracy theory beliefs can be found across the political spectrum, across socio-demographic characteristics. It's important to also talk about the role of social media in all of this. The video talked about the role that a sense of community plays in perpetuating and aggravating conspiracy theories. And social media, of course, provides that. It makes it easier to connect with like-minded believers and to form that sense of community. And of course, also, the algorithms of social media amplify the effects of conspiracy theories. If you were to Google anti-vax or 2020 election rigged or anything like that, you will get, if you were to go on YouTube, for example, or on Facebook and start delving into these kinds of things, the stuff you get at the beginning will be fairly mild. But the more you delve into it, the deeper the dive you do into those subjects on social media, the more extreme the material that will be floated. And that's the algorithm of social media. It's to inculcate a sense of outrage. And it starts small and gets bigger. So social media amplifies the effects of these conspiracy theories. So to sum all this up, we've got a hardwired human inclination towards connecting dots that often aren't connected. We're often wrong. You add to that the tendency for this to happen and for it to be more pronounced among those feeling displaced, having a loss of control, and desiring some sort of simple explanation for complex phenomenon, who seek a community of believers who see things the same way. You add to that social media that provides that sense of community and amplifies that outrage. You add to that political leaders who are willing to exploit all of the above for their personal gain. For example, this is a 2022 tweet from Donald Trump on Truth Social, talking about massive and widespread fraud and deception and working closely with big tech, the DNC, the Democrat Party, to steal the election away from him. He's using this supposed conspiracy of all these entities to steal his election as justification for allowing for the termination of all rules, regulations, and articles, even those found in our Constitution. Donald Trump is calling for disbanding the Constitution to restore him to power as a result of this supposed conspiracy theory that he says denied him power. You put all that together, this tendency, this very human tendency to be susceptible to the allure of conspiracy theories, combined with someone who's willing to exploit that tendency for his own personal gain, and you've got a pretty combustible situation there. You've got an increase in the already existent tribalism in this country and polarization. You've got, as I mentioned, political parties, I'll put it plural because it could happen to either one, but right now it's certainly happening to the Republican Party, being pulled towards extreme positions. The Republican Party as a whole has to basically embrace the conspiracy theory of election denialism and election rigging, because that's Donald Trump's whole mantra, as he is, as I record this, the absolute frontrunner for the nomination in 2024. And all of this becomes a justification for taking politics outside the realm of normal politics and deciding things via elections, and instead deciding things violently. It is no coincidence that QAnon was front and center in much of the January 6th insurrection at the Capitol building. The symbolism of Q was visible throughout the insurrection, and a sizable portion of those who were engaged in that had some affiliation with, some extent of support for QAnon theories. And you put all of that together, and what you've got is a serious threat to democracy. And as the video made clear, it is very difficult to combat conspiracy theories. Any evidence against the theory, any evidence at all about the theory, evidence that supports it, of course, is taken as support for the theory. Evidence against it is viewed as part of the conspiracy by those who hold the conspiracy theory. That makes it non-falsifiable. There is no evidence that you can provide a conspiracy theorist that their views are incorrect. There's no amount of factual information, no amount of logical reasoning that will reason them out of it. When you've got between 20% to 30% of the country that believes that elections are decided by vast conspiracies operating against them, they tend not to accept the legitimacy of those election outcomes. And when that legitimacy is undermined, when we don't accept, it's one thing to feel bad that you lost an election. I mean, nobody likes to lose. But to feel that you lost an election not because your candidate got fewer votes, but because there was some conspiracy to deprive the rightful winner of victory, that's a whole nother thing. Then the institutions of democracy are called into question, and then we have a problem. And we'll take a good look at election conspiracies in the final segment of the class, which is on elections, and that's what we're going to take up next.